In the frozen heart of Wisconsin, a small town kept unimaginable secrets. There, among silent farms and constant fog, lived a simple man with an empty gaze and a broken mind. His name was Edward Theodore Gein, the butcher of insanity. Ed was born in 1906 in La Crosse, Wisconsin. The son of an alcoholic father and a fanatically religious mother, he grew up surrounded by sermons of guilt and hatred. To Augusta, his mother, the world was a pit of sin, and women were its living embodiment. His father, George, drowned in alcohol, leaving the home to decay in misery. Augusta ruled with tyranny and twisted faith. Ed and his brother Henry lived under her sacred word. She warned, "Beyond these walls lies corruption and hell." Ed grew up isolated, no friends, no affection, only his mother's echo shaping his mind. Fear became routine, sin a constant threat. Within that religious silence, something dark was born, an obsession with death and purity. When Augusta died in 1945, Ed lost his ground. The woman who dominated him was also his only link to reality. Without her, emptiness devoured him. The lonely farmer began hearing echoes from the past and sought company among the dead. Ed's house became a shrine of madness. He sealed his mother's rooms like sacred relics. The rest of the home, however, fell into chaos. Amid old newspapers and rusted tools, signs began to emerge, signs of something far more sinister. The people of Plainfield saw Ed as quiet, shy, maybe odd, but harmless. He fixed things, helped neighbors, went to church. No one imagined that beneath that calm face lived an artist of horror, crafting darkness in his silent home. In 1957, the disappearance of Bernice Warden, a local shop owner, shook the town. The last receipt in her store bore Ed Gein's name. When police went to his farm, what they found there surpassed every human nightmare. Masks made of human skin, skulls turned into bowls, furniture covered in flesh. The stench of death clung to every wall. Investigators froze in shock, unable to comprehend what they were truly seeing inside that house. The scene was described as a hell sculpted from bones, mutilated bodies, stitched faces, and fragments cataloged like trophies. Each object told a story, a silent confession of Ed Gein, the man who confused love, faith, and destruction. The evidence horrified even seasoned investigators. Among the remains were preserved heads, stretched skins, and a suit made of human flesh. Ed would later confess, he wore the skins to feel close to his mother again. During questioning, Gein was calm, almost gentle. He spoke of his crimes with disturbing innocence, as if describing ordinary chores. The police realized they weren't facing a typical killer, but a mind shattered by obedience and delusion. He claimed to hear voices, whispers from beyond. He blamed his loneliness and his yearning to revive Augusta. He saw no sin in what he did, only longing. Each corpse was a grotesque attempt to rebuild love, stitched with fear and delirium. Doctors who examined him said Gein lived in a world suspended between faith and madness. He suffered from schizophrenia and necrophilia. He believed that by wearing women's skin, he could become his mother or bring her back. As the trial approached, rural America sank into panic. The thought that an ordinary man could commit such atrocities shattered their sense of safety. Doors were locked, neighbors distrusted, and faith began to tremble. The press flooded Plainfield. Photographers, reporters, and onlookers fought for a glimpse of the monster of Wisconsin. Headlines blended horror with fascination. The case became a mirror of human morbidity, and the nation couldn't look away. In court, Gein seemed detached from chaos. He watched people as though living in another reality. When asked if he felt remorse, he said only, "I don't know what's right or wrong." The room froze. It was the voice of moral emptiness. In 1958, Ed Gein was declared mentally unfit and sent to Central State Hospital. There he would spend the rest of his life, surrounded by white walls and the echoes of voices only he could hear. Justice didn't kill him, it imprisoned his mind. Even in isolation, Ed Gein's name never died. His story inspired films, books, and nightmares. Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Silence of the Lambs were born from his madness. He had become a myth, the face of American horror. When he died in 1984, he was buried beside his mother. His grave was vandalized countless times. Some took pieces of the tombstone as souvenirs, as if Ed's evil still breathed beneath the cold earth. To this day, no one forgets the man who wore death. Even after his death, Gein's farm drew visitors. Some sought answers, others chased morbid thrill. The place was destroyed by a mysterious fire, erasing the last traces of his insanity and consuming the soil where nightmares once lived. Authorities never discovered who set the fire. Many believe it was the townspeople themselves, weary of the stigma. They wanted to erase from the earth the memory of a man who turned a quiet field into a symbol of terror. But Ed Gein's evil didn't vanish with the ashes. It seeped into culture, into collective fear, into the stories told by firelight. With every new horror film, Plainfield's shadow seemed to breathe again, reminding us what we're capable of creating. Psychiatrists who studied him left extensive reports. They described him as a man without awareness of horror, whose morality dissolved in loneliness. His mind transformed love into possession and loss into a macabre ritual. For many experts, Ed Gein was not merely a killer, but a portrait of human collapse, a product of repression, isolation, and fanaticism. His story revealed what happens when fear replaces affection and faith becomes a cage. Some residents of Plainfield still recall Ed's eyes. They say there was kindness in his gestures, as if he didn't grasp the gravity of his acts. A simple man swallowed by madness, an ordinary face hiding an unfathomable abyss. Decades later, scholars re-examined his files. Photos, diaries, clippings. Each page exposed a mind trying to give shape to absence. His desire to possess his mother blurred with his urge to become her. It was a doomed and impossible search. The figure of Ed Gein became a metaphor for domestic evil, the kind that grows inside homes disguised as normalcy. He wasn't a monster from the streets, but the man who fixed windows, smiled, and at night stitched horrors in the dark. The Gein case forced America to confront its own innocence. Evil no longer came from afar. It lived next door, behind the fence, in the quiet neighbor. Rural America learned that terror could wear a familiar face. Today, the name Ed Gein is both legend and warning, a grim reminder that evil doesn't scream, it whispers. Monsters rarely begin as monsters. They're shaped by fear, fanaticism, and solitude. And sometimes they sleep peacefully in the room next door. Many criminologists consider Gein a turning point in American crime history. Before him, evil seemed predictable. After him, it wore a human face. He opened the path to modern understanding of killers who murder through delusion and devotion. The line between insanity and evil is thin. In Gein's case, it simply vanished. He didn't kill for pleasure, but out of emotional necessity. Each act was a ritual of denial, a desperate attempt to speak with death itself. When police traced the origin of his human pieces, they discovered most came from disturbed graves. Ed spent nights in cemeteries, digging up fresh bodies. He worked with surgical precision, guided by a quiet and twisted faith. In the basement, agents found anatomy books, medical manuals, and detailed sketches. Gein studied bodies like one seeks to understand the divine. To him, flesh was both temple and prison, a field where life and death intertwined. One investigator wrote, "He studied death like an artist studies light." The phrase became part of official records. Ed Gein was more than a murderer. He was a sculptor of horrors, seeking beauty in the grotesque and redemption in pain. Over time, criminal psychologists called him the father of modern horror. He inspired generations of fictional psychopaths, yet his true story remains the most terrifying, because it required no invention. It was real. Some say Gein never understood evil. Others believe his madness was deliberate, a refuge to hide guilt. Between his mother's fanaticism and his father's neglect, a man was born divided between love and destruction. The case also revealed cracks in society. Lack of psychiatric care, rural prejudice, and religious silence allowed Ed to descend unnoticed. His madness grew in the same soil that raised wheat and sin. In Plainfield, the name Gein became taboo. Parents forbade children from speaking it. Churches preached against the evil that once lived there. Yet in secret, everyone knew the real horror wasn't Ed, but what he reflected in them. Decades later, the echo of his crimes still drifts through the empty fields. The wind that crosses Wisconsin seems to carry old laments. The house is gone, but the legend remains, alive, pulsing, as if evil itself found a home there. Many modern experts view Gein as a product of extreme isolation. His mind reflected the repression around him. Between authoritarian faith and the silence of solitude, he created a private universe where morality dissolved into darkness. Forensic psychology defines Ed as a reconstructive necrophile. He didn't seek pleasure in death, but the illusion of restoring life. Each exhumed body was a plea to the past, a desperate act of denial, a private cult to his own pain. For years, doctors tried to penetrate his delusion. He answered with disturbing calm, describing rituals as routine tasks. He saw no horror, only necessity. His world made sense only inside his madness, a logic built from grief and faith. Public fascination with Gein went beyond crime. He became a symbol of human duality, the good pretending not to know the evil. Every detail of his case revealed something deeper, how the mind corrodes when empathy disappears. Newspapers of the time exploited the case relentlessly. Headlines screamed of "a house of horrors" and "the man who wore death." The media, hungry for sensation, turned tragedy into spectacle. Ed became a product, and fear a commodity. Yet something more unsettling emerged. People read with disgust, but also with curiosity. Horror attracted them. They saw in Gein a dark mirror, a reminder that, deep down, every human carries a fragment of darkness waiting to awaken. Psychoanalysts noted a crucial aspect. Ed didn't hate his victims. He imitated them. His desire was to become what he feared. Wearing skin was symbolic, a ritual of fusion between lost love and the unbearable terror of being alone. Clinical records mention vivid delusions. He claimed to feel Augusta watching him, approving every act. The dead mother had become divine. Ed didn't kill from impulse, but from devotion, a private religion built from flesh and silence. Even decades later, scholars still debate whether Ed Gein understood evil. Perhaps his insanity ran so deep it erased morality itself. His fractured mind created an inner god who demanded blood in exchange for comfort. Over time, Ed's figure transcended murder. He became a parable of the dangers of fanaticism and loneliness. His story isn't just about crimes. It's about the collapse of the human mind when love transforms into an eternal prison. In hospital archives, doctors documented his routine in detail. Ed read newspapers, made small repairs, rarely spoke of the past. He seemed calm, yet his eyes betrayed something else, the same emptiness that once gave him form. Some nurses said he smiled when hearing hymns. Others claimed he talked to himself, as if speaking with Augusta. The line between memory and hallucination faded away. His cell became merely an extension of his farmhouse. Years later, a psychiatrist said, "Ed was the calmest man I ever met, and that was the scariest part." The silence surrounding him was absolute. No rage, no remorse. Only a morbid peace, impossible to comprehend. As headlines faded, popular culture kept the legend alive. Filmmakers and writers explored Gein's myth as a metaphor for ordinary horror. He had become an archetype, the common man capable of unthinkable abysses. In psychiatric circles, the name Gein became required study. His motives defied diagnosis. He fit no profile. He was a living paradox, the gentle killer, the profane believer, the devoted son of hell. For behavioral experts, the case proved that evil doesn't always stem from violence, but from neglect. The absence of affection, mixed with fanaticism, breeds silent monsters. Gein was the echo of a pain no one cared to hear. Reports from the time describe his hospital room: simple, tidy, spotless. On the table, a worn Bible and a photograph of his mother. Nothing more. That space symbolized the perfect circle, the point where madness folds into itself. Once, someone asked Ed if he believed in forgiveness. He replied, "If God wants to forgive me, he'll know how." The sentence echoed among doctors and journalists. It was spoken with that same calm, the serenity born of total ruin. Years passed, and Ed aged in silence. No outbursts, no escape attempts. He seemed resigned. To him, the hospital was just another farm, and madness, a fertile field where he cultivated memories of Augusta. When death finally came in 1984, many expected relief. But it felt different, as if evil had only changed shape. The body was buried, yet the myth endured. The horror of Ed Gein had become part of humanity's collective memory. After his death, researchers revisited the case, seeking to understand how an ordinary man had crossed every boundary of sanity. Between the lines of his files, they found not only a criminal, but a disturbing mirror of humanity itself. Gein proved that evil doesn't appear suddenly. It grows in silence. It matures in the cracks of the soul, in neglect, guilt, and distorted faith. His story was a warning, a grim reminder that horror can bloom under any roof. Ed's grave became a destination for the curious and the occult. Some left offerings, others chipped pieces of the tombstone as if evil were a relic. The cemetery became a stage for superstition, where the dead still fed the fear of the living. In later years, criminologists coined the term the Gein effect to describe cases where trauma and fanaticism intertwine. His mind became a reference for understanding killers who seek not pleasure, but meaning within the abyss. Transcripts from his interrogations reveal an almost childlike tone. He spoke calmly, corrected details, and chuckled at his confusion. He seemed to live between two worlds, one of flesh, one of memory. Between them lay an endless void. In later interviews, investigators admitted they had never known fear like that, not for what they saw, but for what they realized. Pure evil doesn't need to shout. It only needs to exist. Sometimes it wears the most ordinary face. Gein's image endures as a warning about the destructive power of loneliness. Prolonged isolation corrodes reason, blurs boundaries, and breeds inner demons. His madness didn't explode. It rotted slowly, consuming everything around him. In modern studies, Gein is remembered as the link between rural crime and psychological horror, a man trapped between faith and decay. His life revealed how a loveless mind can transform reality into a nightmare. Some see him as a monster, others as the inevitable result of a diseased home. Either way, Ed exposed the limits of human compassion. In judging him, the world was forced to judge itself, its beliefs, its fears, its own hidden darkness. Decades later, Plainfield's ashes still whisper his name. No house remains, no ruins, only the cold wind and the silence of the hills. But when night falls, some swear they hear footsteps. They say Ed Gein is still searching for his mother. Ed Gein's name still echoes in criminology classes. His story explains the collision between faith and insanity. A reminder that when fanaticism meets solitude, devotion can turn any believer into an instrument of horror. Documentaries and books reinterpret the case through new lenses. Some portray him as a victim of his own religious creation, others as pure evil. Yet all agree on one thing. Ed Gein exposed the price of repression and fear disguised as faith. Each generation rediscovers his myth. Young people study his life with morbid curiosity, seeking to understand what made him that way. Perhaps that's why the case never dies, because in studying Ed, we try to recognize our own abyss. Gein's terror doesn't lie in his murders, but in his mind. He didn't scream, chase, or boast. He simply existed, obedient to the voice that echoed within him. And that voice, to him, was divine, faith corrupted by madness and absence. Interviews with descendants of former residents reveal that, even today, few speak his name. Fear became inheritance, passed from parent to child. No one wants to remember that evil once lived there, disguised as a quiet, helpful man. Modern researchers suggest Ed suffered from a severe form of dissociative psychosis. He built alternate worlds to survive pain. Each object made of skin was symbolic, a desperate attempt to give shape to the loss consuming him. For theologians, the case represents faith's ultimate distortion. Augusta preached salvation, but sowed guilt and terror. Ed merely harvested what he was taught. His blind obedience turned the gospel into an instrument of self-destruction. In police archives, there are photos never shown to the public, images so disturbing they remain sealed. It's said even the examiners grew ill reviewing them. Ed's monstrosity wasn't only in flesh, it was in intent. Criminologists claim Gein was the first to combine necrophilia, fetishism, and religious delusion in one case. This unprecedented mix redefined the boundaries of criminal madness. After him, psychology was never the same. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Ed Gein is his humanity. He wasn't born a monster, he became one. Forged by fear, faith, and abandonment, he proved that evil isn't an exception, but a possibility. Sometimes, silence is all it needs to awaken. As time turns fact into legend, Ed Gein remains a scar on America's conscience. His story transcended crime and became a parable about the madness born when man dares to play God within his own darkness. Modern psychology still debates whether he could have been saved. With early treatment, maybe he'd never have crossed the abyss. But in Plainfield, no one saw illness, only sin. And sin there was punished with silence. In his final years, Ed appeared calm. He painted red and smiled at the nurses. Yet at night, his voice could be heard whispering his mother's name. Even after decades, Augusta still lived within him, a ghost refusing to leave. A reporter who interviewed him shortly before his death wrote, "I've never seen anyone so empty and so peaceful." That peace was the most frightening part. Ed had become his own grave, a man haunted by voices and memory. In studying Gein, we learn more than crime. We learn about the collapse of affection, love that imprisons, faith that corrodes, fear that educates. His life is a cruel mirror of what happens when devotion and delirium intertwine. Every detail of the case feels like a warning, not just about insanity, but about neglect. Ed was raised in an emotional desert where love was punishment, and punishment was virtue. His madness didn't appear. It was cultivated. Even now, one question lingers. What is a monster? Someone born broken, or someone broken by the world? In Ed Gein, both truths coexist. He was victim and executioner, son of faith and servant of emptiness, a human paradox. Some theologians see his case as a symbol of spiritual loss. Ed's life was a dark fable, a man who sought salvation in flesh, trying to stitch faith and madness together until he became a prisoner of his own creation. The true horror of Ed Gein isn't in the bodies, the skins, or the crimes. It's in the belief that he thought he was doing right. When evil believes it acts for good, hell disguises itself as devotion, and no one notices. Today, Ed Gein's name means both madness and fascination. His story endures because it speaks about us, our fear of losing control, of going insane, of looking in the mirror and not knowing if what we see is still human. Experts say understanding Ed Gein means confronting the limits of empathy. He forces humanity to look at itself without disguise. There are no monsters in the void, only reflections of what man becomes when love decays. Words like disease, sin, and evil blur together when his name is spoken. Perhaps Ed wasn't an isolated aberration, but the final product of a society that chose fear over compassion, a cruel reminder that silence kills too. Each generation views his story differently. To some, he is horror incarnate. To others, a warning about the destruction born of repression. But in every retelling, Ed still stares back, motionless, calm, and endlessly human. The farmhouse is gone, the bodies turned to dust, but the name remains. Ed Gein is the ghost that needs no home. He lives in imagination, breathes in film and prayer, a shadow proving true evil never dies. It merely changes form. Filmmakers and writers still analyze him, searching for what drove him. But maybe there is no answer. Ed followed no logic, only pain. And pain, when mixed with guilt and faith, becomes a cage from which no soul escapes. In the halls of criminal history, his name echoes like a warning. Horror doesn't come from the unknown, but from the ordinary. Ed didn't emerge from darkness. He came from home, from family, from faith. That's what makes him terrifying. When we think of Gein, we think of fear, but fear is only the surface. The real horror lies in the tenderness he kept, the contrast between the hand that killed and the serene gaze. Evil can smile slowly and without guilt. Some scholars suggest Ed wasn't searching for victims, but for company. His crimes were a twisted form of conversation, a dialogue between him and absence. And in that dialogue, humanity lost, because the void answered with madness. Today, his case is taught not just as crime, but as a social and psychological phenomenon. Ed Gein exposed what the mind creates when love confuses itself with fear. His story doesn't end in the grave, it lives in every suspicious glance at night. And so this story ends, not of a monster, but of a man who lost his way between faith and insanity. The name Ed Gein remains a scar upon humanity, reminding us that sometimes hell isn't beneath us, but within.